The continent of Africa and its people have for a long time been misrepresented, misconceived, and stereotyped by American society. Africa needs to be studied in order to eradicate the insulting stereotypes and to better educate the American public. This presentation will delve deeper into explaining these misconceptions and what the actual truth about Africa is, analyzing why and how these misconceptions came to fruition, learning who the early proponents of these stereotypes were, considering what factors have caused many of these misconceptions to still be believed by many people in American society, and determining ways in which students and educators can be better educated about what the continent of Africa and its people are actually like. One stereotype that always seems to pop up in any conversation about Africa is the misconceived notion that all Africans live in and belong to tribes. This idea is rather absurd, especially considering that according to Kime, 40% of Africans live in cities. There are many parts of the African continent that are urban cities whose residents, contrary to popular belief, do not live in tribes. Contrary to popular belief, do not live in tribes. The stereotype of Africans being beneath Europeans is a direct result of the early researchers that studied the continent of Africa. These early European scholars argued that because the African societies that they observed were inherently different from European societies, these Africans were inferior because they were savage, uncivilized, childlike, and intellectually inferior to Europeans. The misconception that ancient African people lacked the intellectual capability needed to establish the ancient African states is by far the most ludicrous misconception of them all. The early European scholars used this notion in order to justify the European infiltration and later division of the continent of Africa for imperialist ideas. They did so by arguing that Europeans had the right to conquer African lands because it was Europeans that first established the ancient African states. They argued that the ancient Africans couldn't possibly possess the intellectual capability to establish complex social and political systems, and therefore they must be the products of European contact.
Africa for a great deal of time was considered to be uncivilized and viewed as savages simply because of the categorization of people that was implemented by Lewis Henry Morgan. Morgan set three class systems, and Africans were considered savages because they were hunter-gatherers, and only civilized societies had written languages, cities, and organized states. Hegel strongly believed that Europeans were the only people that could be civilized, which led to the neglect of the African culture. A man by the name of Hegel, who is known in history as the father of philosophy, Hegel believed that Africa was not worthy of research because they lacked conscious history and were undeveloped. Hegel's outlook was also accepted in much of academia, which further corrupts society's outlook on Africa. Denoted as the land of childhood, lying beyond conscious history, enveloped in the dark mantle of night. Molefi Sante wrote a book, and inside it contained a response to Mary Lefkowitz' Not Out of Africa. Lefkowitz, being a classicist, supports a belief that civilization did not begin in Africa, and this belief is something that may be shared by many people around the globe. For her to directly contradict what is seen as common knowledge implies that today's society is still stuck in the mindset that Africa is lesser than that of Europe. Also, individuals like Samuel Huntington, who were deeply involved in the U.S. government, are to blame for the common misconceptions people have on Africa. He is also known for his writings entitled Clash of Civilizations, which listed the world's cultures and completely omitted Africa and wrote them off as being a possible civilization.
Even though we rarely see highlights of things happening in Africa on the news, it definitely shows in advertising, movies, amusement parks, cartoons, and in a lot more other corners of our society. A good example of a general truth of Africa would be the Feed the Children ads they play over and over on TV. These ads just show us that Africa is poor and cannot feed themselves or their children. But in all actuality, all of Africa is not poor, but because of an ad, we generalize the whole state of Africa to be poor. Television happens to be our most common everyday source of ideas about any and everything. Television happens to also be the number one source that represents Africa positively, but the TV shows still do not provide accurate information of Africa. Example would be the many nature programs they film. These shows tend to portray Africa as a place filled with wild animals, park rangers, and naturalists who battle against poachers and encroaching agriculture. By also placing carnivores in these shows, they use Africa as a place that emphasizes survival of the fittest. We see these shows and instantly believe that this is how Africa really is, when in reality, a lot of Africans do not even get a glimpse of a wild animal because they live in towns. Today, 40% of Africans live in cities, and most of the rural Africans are deeply connected to cities in one way or another. The media will not let you know this information, though, because it is easier to make a documentary of the rural parts of Africa than the urban areas. A survey was taken in a very popular museum and discovered was more misconceptions, such as Africans hunt animals for their substances, they have no significant history, Africa is a jungle, and Africans live in grass huts. These messages happen to pervade American culture. They are ideas that have deep roots in American history, as well as the strong branches that entwine our daily lives. We want to look at Africans as savages, so when we look back on our life, we are satisfied with how we live. If we focus on ourselves without comparison to others, do we look pretty messed up? It is as if we just use Africans as a mirror of what not to be or what we could have been. As if Africans are not just like anyone else. We can't be rich without the poor, developed without the undeveloped, saved without the sinner, normal without the abnormal, civilized without the uncivilized.
In the words of Curtis Kim, if readers of textbooks and teachers of classes are wearing tinted glasses, even the most accurate texts will appear to be the same color as the glasses. For much of our history, our education system has been negligent in its teaching on Africa. The reversal of these misconceptions can only be corrected by better education of our students. With the improvement of our education, we will, in turn, be improving our society as a whole. We begin the journey towards cultural awareness by first correcting inaccuracies within our own culture. If we can change the way that Africa is portrayed within our society, be that through the media, books, or speech, we can begin to change our mindset. The cause of our flawed thinking stems from the subtle allusions to Africa that are so prevalent in our society. Both teachers and students are bombarded with mistaken images of Africa in our everyday culture, so it is not surprising that they often mistake Africa for what it is not. Many sources that we may deem as being reliable, such as National Geographic, are often flawed in their representation of Africa, choosing to only show positive images rather than important topics such as social, political, and economic conditions. In the words of Nelson Mandela, though the challenges of the present time for our country, our continent, and the world are greater than those we've already overcome, we face the future with confidence. We do so because despite the difficulties and the tensions that confront us, there is in all of us the capacity to touch one another's hearts across oceans and continents. There are countless reasons why we should study Africa: to correct ignorance, to foster unity, and to learn the respect of all of humankind. We must work diligently in order to reverse this pattern of ignorance and to let go of the misconceptions that we, as a society, have held on to for so long.